What's up, guys? This is Ryan Fee from UpswingPoker.com, making some exclusive content for Card Player. And what we're going to do today is I'm going to give you guys the top five tips I sort of think about what would be most important for people playing live no limit cash games to do differently, to set themselves apart and win more money. So, number one. First things first, I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but for those of you who don't, I think it's really important. You should basically never ever limp when you're first entering the pot. You should always raise. The reason for this is if you're sort of entering the pot, you're already assuming that you sort of have a good hand, so you want to raise, get some value. You don't want to let people come in the pot cheaply behind you. You want to be able to steal the blinds. You don't want to have a limping and raising range, because then when you raise, people can fold, and when you limp, people can raise you with weaker hands and then limp behind and get a cheap flop. So first things first, just never limp when first entering the pot. Maybe if there's a couple limps ahead of you, you have kind of an okay hand and you're in one of the later positions. The pot's not likely to be raised. It's okay to limp some strong but not quite strong enough hands to play. But from early position and when first entering the pot, you should just never do it. Number two, 3-bet preflop. This is the one that I can't emphasize enough. There's just so many players that play either too loose when raising at a full ring table live, or they play they just play badly versus 3-bet. They don't 4-bet enough. They call hands they should 4-bet. They fold too much to the 3-bet. There's a number of things that your opponents could do poorly versus your 3-bet. So by 3-betting, you sort of put them in a tough spot, and you put yourself in a position to take down the pot pre-flop, play a big pot with a lot of equity in position post-flop, and then just generally sort of get more action when you have good hands. So what I've outlined here is a really conservative 3-bet range, sort of like 10s plus, ace king, king queen, ace jack suited, so the really strongest suited broadways, and then some suited connectors. I think sort of every part of this 3-bet range is important. I mean, like queens plus, ace king, just getting a lot of value. King queen, ace jack, ace queen suited, same thing, sort of like getting a lot of value, and I think oftentimes almost always doing better, except for really tight ranges, as 3-bets. Again, because you just have so much equity. You're playing those called pots in position, and when your opponents maybe think you have an overpair, you get to have a bluff, or if they think a queen high board's bad for you, you actually have top pair. Ton of stuff that's great. Great reasons to 3-bet those hands. Obviously making flush draws is great in a big pot like that. And then the suited connectors are really important as well, because there's a ton of spots where there's two broadways on the flop. It's an ace high board, or even there's it's a low flop where you get a piece of, you get a straight draw, something like that. You maybe even flop a straight or two pair, where those hands can operate really effectively as bluffs on the higher boards, and then as value bets or bluffs with equity on the lower boards. And just generally, there's just so many spots where it goes like sort of raise, you 3-bet, your opponent calls, flop is, three sort of uncoordinated cards. You put out a small bet and just take down the pot there. That's such an amazing, so much better result for a hand like, for instance, 8-7 suited, than it would be to just call. A couple other players maybe call behind you. Now you're in this multi-way pot where you don't have all that much. And it's harder to realize equity and get any bluffs through. So number two, 3-bet preflop. Number three, bet the turn in the river. And this is really a product of for a long time, I think now players will raise hands preflop and bet the flop. And it used to be that players would just fold the flop. They're like, oh, I don't have top pair, I don't have a flush draw, I don't have a set. And they would just fold. But now players are more willing to at least call the flop and then sort of see what happens on the turn or river. And unless you have a weird image, if you look like me, you're gonna not get as much credit. But for your sort of more average run-of-the-mill live player, I don't expect to see very many hero calls in live poker. In fact, the opposite. Like, I've seen a lot of both, but I've just seen in really straightforward spots, like just ace high board, you just bet 3 times and Opponents fold ace queen and ace jack to the river barrel. So I think betting the flop is definitely a good idea. If you have a sensible hand to flop c bet with, or bet the flop in like whatever situation. But I think betting the turn of the river, that's where you're going to get like a lot of sort of crazy, silly, stupid folds where your opponents aren't going to realize how much you're bluffing, and they'll sort of overestimate how often you're value betting, because other people, and when they've called down in those spots, always have value bets. So by you're sort of capitalizing on everyone else being tight, everyone else thinking everyone is tight, and then getting in there with some bluffs. Another quick sort of side topic for this is that for the most part, people perceive and then also themselves tend to always bet the flop or the turn if it sort of wasn't their turn to bet. They maybe were in the big blind and checked. Top pair on the the flop or the turn when it was checked to them. So if they've double checked, or their pre-flop raise are in check, chances are they don't have top pair, and you can take advantage of that by barreling both really thin for value, but then also getting in there with some bluffs and trying to make them fold. Number 4, call many hands in the big blind, especially versus the button raise first in. So I think this is a big mistake a lot of live players make. They don't really understand how pot odds, work, or how important they are, and they just fold too many hands in the big blind, and especially versus button raise first in, where I have the equity calculations for 5 different hands versus a 70% button raise first in, but I know there's some live players that raise up to 100% on the button. Some play tighter and play 40 to 50, but many are very loose, raising 50 to 70% of the time on the button. And you'd be surprised to see how much equity some of these like sort of weaker suited hands, sort of weaker offsuited hands would have versus those raises or those ranges. And you would be surprised and probably get the price to call. One thing I should say about this is that hands like 4-3 and 7-4 suited will tend to do a good job of retaining or realizing all of their equity, whereas hands like King 7 offsuit, Queen 7 suited, Queen 2 suited, to a lesser extent 7-6 offsuit, will do a sort of poorer job of realizing their equity. And number 5. Play deep. Once you have a sense for the game, once you're a winning player in the game, you know how people play, a goal of yours should be to try to buy in 200, 300 big blinds deep and get as deep as possible with live players. Really for 2 reasons. There are some spots where, you can intimidate them and maybe bluff them in some big spots. But more so than that, you're just sort of like waiting around. You're just sort of like waiting around with your net out, just waiting for somebody to just punt off all of their money, into your net. And it kind of wouldn't matter if you had 200 or 400 big blinds. Like, they were just going to like YOLO all their money in with top pair, or, maybe even a set, or, whatever, into a spot where you have way too many better hands and would never call with worse. So you just want to be out there just ready to just, 2K, and just catch that money, catch as much of that money as possible. So, there are definitely some bluff implications as well, and those are a little bit more tricky, a little bit more complicated. But the lowest hanging fruit for this type of stuff is really just them doing something really dumb with just two. I mean, it's maybe a bluff, but it's either sometimes it's a bluff and sometimes it's like a really weak made hand in a relative sort of relative situation. So, for instance, kings on 10-9-5 is a really strong hand, but if they've, bet the flop and you've raised and then they re-raise, now all of a sudden kings is no better than a bluff catcher, because chances are if you're raising the flop, you've got 2 pair or set. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. And if you did, you want to learn more, check out the Upswing Poker Lab. It's a complete course A to Z, where myself and Doug Polk break down all of our thoughts on No Limit. We include pre-flop ranges, very concise pre-flop ranges, how to play, and live cash games, online cash games, and multi-table tournaments, and then a very extensive post-flop section where we outline exactly how to play just about every single spot post-flop, and then and it grows every month, a growing play and explain section where all that whole strategy that you just learned, you see executed in real time with me and Doug playing. So if you want to take your 6 max no limit game or ring no limit game to the next level, be sure to check out the Upswing Poker Lab.